They are not parasitical. They do provide a service. That's the tragedy of it. Because if they were simply parasites, if they were just thieves, if there are a gang of thieves that rob flats, the police would just round them up and put them in jail and you would never hear of them anymore. But these people do something for communities, and they provide a degree of security and services to the communities that the state doesn't provide.
That's Federico Varese explaining how organized crime often emerges to fill unmet needs in a community by providing protection or access to justice when the state fails to do so. It's this ability to meet a real demand that helps these groups take root and remain resilient in society. Federico is a professor of criminology at the University of Oxford and a senior research fellow at Nuffield College. His work focuses on organized crime as a system of governance, examining how criminal groups emerge, expand, and adapt across different societies. He's written extensively on the Russian Mafia, Italian Mafia groups, Somali piracy, the migration and evolution of Mafia organizations, and the use of social network analysis to understand criminal behavior. He's author of several books, including The Russian Mafia, Mafias on the Move, Mafia Life, and Russia in 4 Criminals. Federico's research and commentary have appeared across leading media platforms, including The Economist, the BBC, The Guardian, and The New York Times. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, Federico takes us inside the hidden machinery of mafia governance, how these groups rise, rule, and reveals their negotiation and power strategies along the way. Some topics discussed include what counts as organized crime and the 3 core functions these groups serve in society, how mafia organizations, like the Ndrangheta, end up performing state-like roles in protection, dispute resolution, and governance, the global scale of organized crime, and why tens of millions of people live under the rule of criminal governance, how weak justice systems, slow courts, and limited access to social services create conditions for organized crime to take hold, why effective reintegration after conflict is critical to prevent armed groups from entering into organized crime, what Federico's research on mafia behavior reveals about negotiation, from informational power and credible commitments to trust, respect, reputation, and the ways criminal groups influence others without relying solely on violence, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Federico. Welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So, I want to start with the basics, understanding organized crime, and then move into some of the nuances around conflict and negotiations later. So, right from the foundations here, what is organized crime? And actually, I found a definition that you gave in an older paper of yours as a group that attempts to regulate and control the production and distribution of a given commodity or service unlawfully. Can you go further into this? I mean, when I think about it, of course, the mafia comes to mind, a cartel, the Yakuza in Japan, but so does like human or wildlife trafficking, community gangs, pirates, maybe even rebel groups and political conflict. So what's the scope here, and what groups do you consider to meet the definition, and why?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is a lot of confusion in the literature, so I'm not surprised that readers are confused. And I think the concept is overstretched. And so a lot of my work recently has been trying to go back to the concept and give it some sort of clarity and foundation. So to cut a long story short, I think there are 3 elements to organized crime which are separate from each other. The first element, which applies to several groups, including the traditional mafias, is exactly what you cited. So these are groups that are in the business of regulating life. They regulate who can do what. If you and I have a dispute over this podcast, they would come in and settle the dispute. These are groups that have access to violence, and ultimately they serve the function that the state serves in legal markets. So there is a bunch of groups that do that, and they specialize in doing that. They use violence, they have a reputation for violence, and I can go into some of them in details. Now, this is not the end of the story. There is more to organized crime than this kind of groups that we can call, roughly speaking, the mafia. There are people who are in the business of producing drugs. So there are people that, are on a field in Colombia and organize peasants. So they have a farm, and the farm is organized, and they pick up leaves that are eventually processed and turn into cocaine. Now, that is a different kind of job. It's not about dispute settlement. It's about producing a good, which happens to be illegal. And sometimes it's illegal, sometimes it's turned to be legal. It goes back and forth. But these are producers of an illegal good. And thirdly, the third kind of major activity that we find in what is traditionally called organized crime is exactly what you mentioned. Human trafficking, moving people from one place to another. So let's say the cocaine is produced in Tumaco in Colombia, which is one of the highest production regions of Colombia. Once it's produced, some people specialize in taking the cocaine to a port, put it into a container, and transshipping it to Europe, to London or to Gioia Tauro in Calabria. Now, this is a third type of activity called trade, what I call trade. So to go back to the general picture, there are people who are involved in the production of the good, which happens to be illegal. Then there are people who are involved in the transportation of the good from one place to another. And a lot of what goes under the label of money laundering, human trafficking, human smuggling, smuggling of arms, and all of that. It's all about moving stuff from one place to another. Stuff that has already been produced by somebody else. And then there is a third category of people who set themselves up as those who give you permission to produce, who give us permission to trade, which is a state function, as I said before. So these are the three building blocks of the picture that has to be very clear for us to work with. And so that's my answer.
Mm-hmm. So by function or role, and are these also mutually exclusive? Like one group focuses on one, or could one group typically be involved in all three categories of roles there?
So this is a definition based on activities. So it's, as you said, functional diversification is based on what you do. It's not based on how you organize. It's not based on ethnicity, of course. So you don't have to be Italian or Russian to do this. So it's a definition based on activities. Now, the question you ask is an empirical question. Do groups do more than one thing or tend to specialize? So we leave the empirics to tell us. I think the counterintuitive view is that they tend to specialize quite a lot. And now, that opens up a huge debate in criminology. Some groups, I would accept that they do more than one thing. But I think there is a tendency to specialize. And above all, there is a tendency to do one of the activities as your main activity. So a typical example when we talk about this of groups who are multifunctional is the 'Ndrangheta, which is now the biggest organized crime group in Italy. They control half of Calabria, more or less, and they control the port of Gioia Tauro, and where the containers arrive from Latin America through a roundabout way. And they are normally cited as an example of multifunctional, because certainly they are involved in the drugs trade, they're involved in ensuring that the drugs arrive to the port and then they pass them on, but they're also involved in governing, in controlling the territory. So that could be an example in which they do both. However, the thing that comes first is the control of the territory. The reason why the 'Ndrangheta is so prominent in the trade of drugs is because it controls a particular chunk of Calabria. And because they govern, they can enter the market of drugs. And I hope it's clear. So yes, groups can do more than one thing, and I'm very happy to look at examples and be told of examples of that kind. But it's also true that they do one thing, but there is one major activity. So, the Fiat car production company that, I grew up with as an Italian, they produced cars. Of course, they also reinvested the money they made. They also produced something else. They published a book occasionally. But the core activity was car production. The core activity of the 'ndrangheta is to govern, is to do protection, is to be a mafia. So that's my view, that I think they tend to have a core activity. But I mean, occasionally they can do both.
Interesting. So under those three umbrellas of functions, does that mean we can extrapolate from that and we could say that, yes, indeed, community gangs, serve function one of regulation within the community, so they would fit your definition, and sort of you can work that way to sort of extrapolate who fits the definition?
So yeah. Absolutely. So the groups that are involved in governance, in controlling territories, regulating the local economy, protection, and often it looks like as extortion or racketeering, dispute settlement, controls of cartelization of the economy. They go from ordinary street gangs to very elaborate mafia types, to also, if you go up the ladder of complexity and you move out of standard crime, to insurgencies and ultimately to the state, right? This is the same continuum. So yes, so I wrote a paper with co-authors about London, and we identify gangs that are involved in governing and protection, and gangs that are only involved in selling drugs, for instance. These are the very, very low level of organization and reach. But then, as you go into more complex groups, you see the mafias, you see the Sicilian mafia, you see, the Godfather type of stuff, the Italian-American mafia, the Yakuza, the Russian mafia. Then if you look at the FARC, the FARC also is a very similar organization in which they use, of course now they are disbanded, but they used to control a territory. They lived off drugs production, but ultimately they were a state authority in their territory. And so for me, if you have to write a textbook of sociology, let's say, normally in sociology you have a chapter on the state and a chapter on crime and deviance, right? And the two things are separated. I would put the mafia in the chapter on the state, not in the chapter on crime and deviance, because they have a state function. Although, of course, they do it in a immoral way and ways that are unjust and not legitimate, but they still do something which is very similar, like a state, to what a state does.
Okay, so we that's really useful to get an idea of the scope here, based on those three baskets. Now, how ubiquitous are these groups? Are they appearing everywhere? Is there any distribution patterns about where they commonly emerge, or characteristics where they commonly emerge? Or are they pretty much every population, every region is going to have some group forming one of these functions?
That's a very good question. So I was just looking up the 2020 Latino Barometer survey. So it's a survey of Latin America, and it finds that 13% of all respondents in Latin America reported that governance by a criminal group in their neighborhood. So this amounts to some 70 million people in Latin America, 70 million people. Wow. And so the authors of this survey mentioned that the qualitative answers would be, that who is in charge, they would be asked. And the answer by the respondent is it's the local gang, the Mara, the militia, the colectivo, basically. So in Latin America, if you believe this survey, which is, very good, we think, it's probably underestimating the phenomenon, there are 70 million people under criminal governance, 70 million people. Now, then, of course, you would imagine the traditional mafia territories, Sicily, half of Sicily at least, parts of Calabria, parts of Campania in Italy, southern Italy, parts of northern Italy, of course. Russia, parts of Russia, Japan. So the traditional mafia, the Italian-American mafia in New York City, that's also part of the group. But then we shouldn't make the mistake that this is only a phenomenon that occurs in the South, such as Latin America, the global South, or in traditional mafia territories. One of the big stories about the mafia in the recent 30 years in Italy is that the mafias moved from the South to the North. And so there is a big presence of traditional mafia in the north of Italy, which traditionally was an area where there was not. And it's a very advanced economies such as Lombardy or Piedmont, which is as rich as Germany, right? Lombardy is extremely rich. So you have it in the non-traditional territory. Incidentally, I wrote a book called Mafias on the Move where I discussed this. And then recently I wrote a paper about the city of Nottingham, which is a city, again, in England, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with this kind of people. And we did a very in-depth study, which was published in a very prestigious journal called Nature, in which we study a particular neighborhood of the city. We have a lot of data, crime data, survey data, and qualitative data. And to cut a long story short, this neighborhood was also run by a boss who was considered to be the local authority. So he wasn't just a guy selling drugs on the street. He was a guy who had a big house in the neighborhood and put himself up as the authority, the ultimate authority you could turn to if you had a problem, such as they stole your car. And the police was very worried about this guy, not just because he was a criminal and he's a murderer and he's also serving time for a murder now, but also because he created an alternative authority, and the same in London. So I couldn't give you like a global number. Maybe that's my next research project. But you find it in many parts of the world. You find them in communities which are dissatisfied, or maybe not, the word dissatisfied is not correct, which are alienated from mainstream society. So in immigrant communities which cannot turn to the state for legitimate authority and protection, often are prey to these kind of people. So it's a really a problem, which is not everywhere, of course, but it can be everywhere.
That's interesting. So I was going to ask that next, actually. Is there any clear deficiencies or characteristics of the state that make it more favorable for these groups to get a footing there?
That's a very good question. And I think the short answer is that there is no trust between the community and the state. And the community doesn't see the state as something you can turn to for protection and governance. Now, for a variety of reasons, you don't see that as a trustworthy entity. Maybe because the state is particularly lousy at settling disputes. So Italy, for instance, has got a very, very long waiting time for a court case to be settled, especially civil courts. So the last time I checked, I think it was 10 years. So imagine you and I have a conflict over, the driveway. Your driveway is bigger than it should be, and according to the chart, it should be, half a meter shorter, and it comes into my side. So we have a typical ordinary dispute that could be settled very easily in a civil court. In Italy, it takes 10 years to on average, to get it done, right? Imagine we are a business, two businesses. You haven't paid me what I expected. I haven't delivered what you expected. There is money involved and inflation going on, right? And so these are the kind of disputes that the state should settle very fast, because they are at the heart of the social order that the state should provide to business people and citizens. The moment the state doesn't do that very well, then there is a demand or a tendency to look somewhere else. It doesn't mean automatically that there will be a mafia to settle the dispute. It might be, it might be not, but it is a condition that might lead to the presence of these people. There are other reasons why they might be there, but if there is this demand, obviously they would serve a function. People would use it, right? And they wouldn't see it as pure predatory, because they would settle the dispute. And we have a lot of evidence that this is happening in Sicily. I have a lot of stories to that. For instance, there was a guy who was paying rent for his bar, but the owner of the building was not doing the renovation he had promised. So the guy didn't want to pay rent. The other guy didn't want to do renovations. And then they called the mafia boss, and they sit around the table and they found a solution, which is usually halfway in the middle, more or less. Not very different from what a state would do. So that to me is the major condition. Now, in the paper we did on London, which is a highly statistical, we find, for instance, that gangs that tend to govern more are also gangs in territories or neighborhoods which are further away from social services, which I think is a very interesting finding, because social services such as schools, doctors, hospitals, are very important and are an indication of governance, right? The presence of the state in, and so the further you are from these entities, schools, hospitals, the more of this kind of protective governance gang you find. So that's another interesting finding. And that finding has been, I saw recently other papers that go along the same line. I hope that was the answer that you find satisfactory.
Lots of pieces there. You know, the demand, the trust between the community and the state, feeling alienated. The dispute settlement piece is really interesting. I want to come back to that. And then the distance from the social services, really interesting. I guess that's a good segue into transitioning or fragile states. You know, there must be a bit of a vacuum created there, you know, during and after violent conflict. And I assume it'd be easier for these groups to get a foothold during those times, or maybe not. Maybe there's a higher competition rate between them. I'm not sure. But do you know anything about that particular situation and anything that peace builders, you mentioned the FARC, but anything that peace builders could keep in mind during these times? What is happening from that lens during these talks? And
absolutely. So probably the most important thing to say on this is that when a conflict ends, you have people trained in the use of violence who become suddenly unemployed, or suddenly they have no purpose, right? Because the conflict has ended. So imagine the IRA fighters in Northern Ireland, or Colombia, of course, you know, the FARC that you mentioned, or the AUC, you know, the paramilitaries in Colombia. So you have at the end of the conflict, you can see also Iraq, of course, the war in Iraq, or possibly in the Ukraine eventually. So you have the end of the conflict, but you have people trained in violence who find themselves unemployed or unutilized. And so there is a highly, again, you have to be very careful, because these people might end up in organized crime, might end up in continuing under different guises what they were doing before, i.e. using violence and threatening violence. And so the case of Northern Ireland, I think, is very interesting, because you had a peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, in which the IRA and the British state, you know, came to a pact in some sense and decided to stop the fighting. But some people were splinter groups who didn't accept that, they continued the fighting. And so this is what you need to be very careful. The people who used to be in the insurgency, or in how you want to call it, the terrorist group or the insurgency, have to be reintegrated in a way that they will not be, as it were, on the market using violence. So that is the biggest insight, I think, that comes from my kind of research for the kind of issues that I know you're interested in, that you have to pay a huge attention to people who used violence during the war or the fighting, and how to reintegrate them into society is absolutely crucial. You might not be able to reintegrate them all, but if you forget about them, then you have a pool of people who basically only know how to use violence.
Great point. And is there a specific, will they form their own groups, or are there other groups that would move in, other established networks that would move in and take advantage of that? And sort of an extension to that, do you have any examples, or have heard of or know of organized crime groups that act as spoilers at all?
So certainly the case of Northern Ireland is also a spoiler to some extent, right? Because these people continue to fight and continue to, but also you have it in Latin America as well. You know, some of the groups associated to the FARC continue to fight and were spoiler in a sense to the broad group of the FARC that demobilized. And also on the paramilitary group, there were talks to end the fighting, but they didn't, and so they continued. So they spoiled the transition to peace. And so that certainly is our cases. So Latin America, Colombia, certainly Northern Ireland, they seem to be groups that are supposed to leave or give up their arms, but they don't. At least some of them don't, and continue to do it. And so what you have in Latin America now, especially in Colombia, is that these groups, basically, despite the FARC having demobilized, but the others have not. So the AUC, various incarnation, has continued to produce drugs, and to the point that now drugs production in Colombia is the highest ever. So yes, we certainly see groups that are spoilers. Now, in the case, so you say, do they are old groups or do they emerge anew? I think we see both. Obviously, if they are old, it's easier. So I think what happened in Northern Ireland, for instance, is that the people that used to be in the IRA, and they used to extort communities, for the bigger cause of the cause, but you had to pay protection money, in effect, to the group. So now the cause is gone because there is a peace, but you continue to extort them and be involved in drugs selling, which is what these former IRA are doing. And so they, in a sense, are the same people who used to do it before, and they continue to do it. The same in Colombia, I think. There are these old groups that continue to act, or splinter groups from the old groups. So there is a sense of solidarity. But it could also be that new groups emerge and from scratch. So I think both scenarios can happen.
That's very interesting, the DDR aspect of that. How about shifting into their inner workings a bit more here? How do they operate internally? And maybe there's a lot of variation here, and externally. So in terms of governance and power. Can you speak briefly? That's a big one, I think, but can you
so
speak
we're talking,
that?
yes, absolutely. So we're talking about the governance ones, right? The organized crime groups that have an aspiration to control territories, and because they have a different structure from the others that I mentioned, the producers and the traders.
So
but
each bucket has a different.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so
that's my view.
Bucket one then.
Bucket one is the governance one, the protection and the mafia type. Well, the structure of these groups tend to be very similar, and the structure is basically hierarchical, because you cannot really run a protection racket or run a government, with like a network and, let's meet occasionally and do this stuff on the side. They are quite well organized with a clear entry point. The guys I studied, they have rituals, but also gangs are quite well organized. And you need a boss, you need somebody in charge, and you need somebody who gives order. And you need a military structure. You need access to violence. You need people who can use violence. It may not be an army, but certainly people you can rely upon to use violence. So this is really the bottom line. You cannot be in the business of governance or protection or criminal governance and not be organized in a hierarchical structure. So ultimately there is a boss, there is a guy in charge, and he has a deputy, and then there are sort of lieutenants, and then there are soldiers, and they operate. That's basically how each mafia family is organized around the world, traditional mafias. Now, a little complication is that the traditional mafias are really interesting beasts in terms of organizational structure, because a traditional mafia, say the Sicilian mafia, which still operates, is a combination of individual mafia families that coordinate with each other. So you have the individual mafia families in Palermo, which are like but they used to be around 60, but they share a common view, they share rituals, they share norms. And so they are basically hubs and spikes. So you have each family is a hub, and the hubs are coordinated with each other. And this is it's the commission, basically. So what in the US context would be called the commission, which is an interesting development or variation on the point that I made earlier. But ultimately, the military power in traditional mafia resides in the family, so-called family, and the family is organized hierarchically with a boss, underboss, captains, soldiers, and they use violence. They use violence rationally, and they use violence without exaggeration. They economize on violence, but they do use violence. There is no way out of it.
I'm curious about the other two baskets there, the producers and the trade. But in terms of the hierarchy sort of being ubiquitous across all these groups, I'm curious, are there cultural nuances or major cultural nuances between groups that are using that structure?
So the short answer is not much. I mean, it depends what you mean. Of course, they all come from different histories. They come from different countries. Let's say the ritual, for instance, that you have to go through in order to join has got differences. So in Italy, they have the picture of a saint, which is burned in your hands, and you recite a formula saying, if I betray this organization, I will burn, like the picture of the saint that is burning in my hands. In Hong Kong, where there is the Hong Kong triads, they chop the head of a chicken and they pour the blood of the chicken into cups, and the cups goes around and they drink it. So it's like a blood communion. In Japan, it's different. So there are cultural variations, and the Italian mafia is very Catholic, of course. The Russian mafia is very pro-Russian Orthodox, and they have a great devotion to their local church. So these are cultural variation, if you wish, but the essence is the same. They have a ritual. The ritual is memorable, and they tend to be conservative. They tend to align with the powers of the church. And so there is cultural variation, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. At least analytically and sort of operationally, they are very similar. And what is extraordinary is that the norms that are read out at the ritual, so when you go through the ritual, they read out the commandments of the organization, which is like, do not betray the group, do not speak to the police, obey the boss, do not sleep with somebody else's wife from mafia. So they've got a lot of rules about sex and violence. Do not use violence without permission. These kind of rules, which are identical across the groups. So the Japanese mafia, which have got nothing to do with the Italian, have the same rules, which is extraordinary. The similarity, almost identical. So there are cultural variations, but I wouldn't exaggerate them because I think if you have to run an organization of this kind, you need basic structures, which are the same, and you need basic rules of behavior, which are, broadly speaking, the same.
Interesting. So historically, then, have these types of groups always sprung up on the fringe of the state in the same way? Is there any record of these sort of like how far back?
Yes. So we know, and there has been a lot of research into the origins of the Sicilian mafia, the origins of the Japanese mafia. I wrote a lot about the origins of the Russian mafia, and again, to cut a long story short, there are a lot of similarities in how they emerged. So let's take the Sicilian and the Japanese. They both emerged in the 19th century. They both emerged at the time of a rapid transition to capitalism from a feudal society. So Sicily in the 19th century, at the very beginning of the 19th century, when it was invaded by Napoleon, between 1806 and 1812, they liberalized the land. So they privatized the land massively, which used to be owned by the church and by the big barons. So the country or the island goes from being feudal, so in which you have a feudal lord that controls the land and people work on the land, but they cannot buy it unless the feudal lord gives it to them. It goes from that situation, which is feudalism, to capitalism, in which you have a market for land, property rights, and access to water, and you have now small middle-class plot owners of land. But the problem with the Italian state is that it was not very able to clearly define and protect property rights over the land and over the transportation of goods from the interior of the island to the markets in Palermo, so on the exterior of the island. So there was a lot of crime, a lot of uncertainty over the legal structures, and a lot of demand for protection. So this is when the Sicilian mafia emerges. And it emerges at this moment in which there is a spread of property the emergence of capitalism, but the inability of the state to govern the capitalist transformation. Hence, these people come in and govern in a criminal way what the state should have done. And so the mafia, which is another important point, is not a product of the distant past. It is actually a product of something very modern, which is the market economy, capitalism, and the fact that you can buy and sell things. So the Japanese story is very similar. I can tell you if you want, but it's a very similar story.
The Yakuza, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
they are fascinating. I think I mentioned to you earlier, I just learned a bit about them and how they have these sort of public newspapers in a way, like stories that are publicly available that kind of convey information about everything about the inner workings and killings and who's at the top, and it's the news. Just so it's very similar. You're saying the conditions were ripe for them to emerge, and they filled the hole and served a purpose. The demand was there, as you said earlier.
Exactly. So I have a collaborator who is called Martina Baradel, who is now in Japan, and she's the biggest expert, I think, on organized crime in Japan now. So she is publishing a book now, and she has published a lot of papers. So I defer to her in a sense about this. But the story of the emergence of the Japanese mafia is also that at some point, the feudal lords in Japan in the 19th century lost their power, and Japan unified under a powerful emperor. And so these feudal territories, which I think were called Han, lost their power. And each of these feudal territory had its own army, its own currency. The samurai were basically working with the feudal lord to control the people. Now, this comes to an end also very rapidly, overnight almost, in a matter of 10 years, like in Sicily. And so you have suddenly privatization of land, introduction of Western civil codes, criminal codes, the introduction of a national police, and ultimately the unification of the state under an effective emperor. However, it was effective only to some degree, because there was a lot of disputes left unsolved in many parts of the country. So what the Yakuza did was often former samurai, i.e. people trained in the use of violence who become suddenly unemployed, that now start to offer protection to peasants, protection against other thieves or themselves possibly samurai, or also protection over disputes. So the point I was making earlier about wars, when the war end, and there are people trained in violence who become unemployed. But this is how mafias emerge, because you usually have people who used to be employed, in this case by the feudal lord, who become unemployed. And the same in Sicily, you have the field guards, you had the so-called bravi that were part of the feudal army of each feudal lord. But when the feudal control comes to an end, these people become unemployed and they join the mafia.
I'd like to just a bit more on the internal workings. You mentioned that violence was one of the main branches, some sort of organized violence branch within these groups was common. Were there any other ways other than violence that they use as a form of influence and power, or is it always with the stick?
So it depends to whom. I mean, the stick is very important for their own members because they have to be disciplined, and also they have to be very menacing to the people in the neighborhood. So not only violence, but also reputation for violence. So having a reputation for being fearsome is very important for them, which doesn't mean that they use the violence, but it means that they have used it a lot in the past, so people will not dare to disobey. So reputation for violence is very important, which is different from violence. However, they also have a relationship with the state, of course, and as you said, with power, and often they interact with the existing state where they operate. So in the case of a democratic state, a typical function of the mafia is to organize the vote for the politicians. So the mafia would be able to organize voting for the local politician. And so in that sense, they don't use violence, although of course they make sure that the people who promise to vote for the politician do so. But in that sense, the influence of the mafia towards society at large is through politics, and especially voting.
Voting.
Yeah, because they can control the vote. So, the local politicians would ask the mafia to deliver the votes, and the mafia would use the people they know to vote for the local politician that then gets elected and will then do favors back.
Interesting. These groups are obviously successful. They're resilient, they're effective. Is there anything we can learn from these groups to do things better, either individually, at the community level, organization, the state? Is there anything they're doing well that we can learn from, or even that you think, we might outright adopt?
Well, they are certainly resilient, and traditional mafias have been around for almost 200 years, right? So the Sicilian Mafia, for instance, so obviously they are very resilient. The Russian Mafia, for instance, went through Stalinism, went through the end of the Soviet Union, and they're still there. So I certainly would agree with you that they are resilient, and so actually I wrote a paper titled "The Resilience of the Russian Mafia." So they are certainly resilient. So what do they do right? Well, I think what they do, and I think we need really to be clear about this, is that they are not parasites. They are not parasitical. They do provide a service. They do something that people benefit from. That's the tragedy of it. Because if they were simply parasites, if they were just thieves, if there are a gang of thieves that rob flats, the police would just round them up and put them in jail, and you would never hear them anymore. But these people do something for communities, and they provide a degree of security and services to the communities that the state doesn't provide. So that is what they do right. And for various reasons, the community, of course, the community is also threatened by these groups. So I'm not saying they are angels, but they're not. It's not just about the threat. It's also about the fact that these people live in the community and do something for the community. So what the state can learn, and the local authorities, is to do that kind of job themselves. So to be trusted by the community, to provide services, and especially to provide justice, a justice that is effective and swift. That is really what the state should learn about these groups. There is no rocket science here. I mean, it's not that there is such a very complicated policy recommendations. You need states that govern communities in a fair and just way. Look at what happened in Rio de Janeiro the other day, when 132 people were killed by the police. That's typically the wrong approach, because it just goes into the favelas and kill people and leave. What you should do is to go into the favelas and offer justice and protection and security and services for the people. That would be the solution. I mean, obviously, it's a very broad policy advice, but I think that's the right way, not to criminalize communities, and certainly not to go in and murder them.
So is that the resilience then, is because there's this deficiency and there's this need that is that exactly how they become resilient? Because
I think so. Needed? I think so. That's exactly the point, because the resilience comes from the fact that they perform a service. So that you can kill the single boss. The Sicilian Mafia has been, all the bosses are in jail. There was a maxi trial in 1982. They arrested 500 people. Most of the bosses now are in jail, and yet the mafia is still there. I mean, it's weakened, but it's still there. The same applies to the others. This Italian-American mafia was just now in the news again for these poker games. I don't know if you followed. There was a series of illegal poker games in New York. So they are resilient, but not the single individual, but the organization. Because once you get rid of a boss, there is another one coming, and he will have a market, in a way of life. And I say he because they're mostly men, of course.
So if they're a normal part of society, is there any examples of state actually negotiating with them and finding this coexistence? I guess that wouldn't be well documented, but anything along the lines of some sort of engagement where they're, whatever it may be, setting out some sort of rules of engagement to coexist, or anything like that, or is it just sort of turned a blind eye and
So, I mean, to engage and to discuss or to cooperate is very dangerous, of course, because basically you entrench them. So if you openly negotiate with the mafia, so the mafia is not an insurgency, it's not a terrorist organization. They don't have a political project as such. Of course they govern, but they govern for money. And it's not that they want to change the government in Rome or in London or in Washington. So the moment you engage with them and cooperate or negotiate with them, you give them a huge amount of power ultimately. Said that, of course, this has happened. It has happened in the history of the mafia. It's happening today. So there was a famous instance in 1942 in the docks of New York, in which the American government asked the Italian-American mafia to control the docks of New York. And Lucky Luciano said yes, and so they had a collaboration over checking that there were no Nazi saboteurs on the docks of New York. And as a gift, Luciano left prison and was allowed to go back to Italy, and few others. So there was that historical story, which has been really well documented there was a Senate committee about it. Then, of course, there was, in Italy, so-called trattativa. So there was a moment in which it seemed that the Italian, or elements of the Italian state, were having a trattativa, which means negotiation with the mafia, in order to make them stop the bombing campaigns in Florence and in Milan and in Rome in the 90s. Again, it wasn't the state negotiating, but certainly elements of it were talking to the mafia. El Salvador, of course, had an example in which the main two gangs were called to stop by the local bishop with the support of the state, but that collapsed as well. So there was a moment in which the murder rate, I think, was 70 for 100,000, and after this negotiation, it went down to 40, which was a massive drop in that particular negotiation. And the state was facilitating the negotiation between the two gangs, and it led to a massive reduction in murder rate. However, it collapsed this pact of peace, and it was resumed, the war between the two groups. So to answer, yes, there are examples of discussions and negotiations, but I would be cautious in doing it because they don't go very far. The state often is not a very good negotiator itself, so they don't necessarily follow through with their promises. So then the mafia gets upset and they renegade, and as well as the gangs. So it's not that the state is necessarily better at this or more ethical. So I would be cautious. I think the best way is really to engage with the people and remember that these organizations are criminal organizations and are committing huge amount of violence and harm to the community. And so by negotiating with them, in a sense, you leave the community in their pockets, in the pockets of the gangs, which I don't think is the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to win the heart and mind of the community and to eliminate, of course, the gang in a military way. I mean, obviously, these people have to be arrested and tried.
So that we're pretty much full circle then back to the conditions you mentioned earlier, addressing the trust between the community and the state, the social services being far. So dealing with those is the approach. Sensitive to your time, I know you have a dinner to go to. I wanted to just get into the negotiations. Just two more questions. One on credible commitments, which is important to negotiation concept. It's hard to make a deal if you don't think the other person is credible, if they'll follow through. And I believe you looked at the scenario of transferring money between jurisdictions. What did you find in that? Briefly, if you could.
Absolutely. So credible commitments is a fantastic concept from game theory. And I've used game theory in my work. I'm a great fan of Thomas Schelling, who wrote a fantastic book called The Strategy of Conflict, and where he studies a number of games, including coordination games, so not just standard Princess Dilemma. And credible commitments is exactly something he discusses in that book, right? If you remember, he has a story about somebody who is kidnapped and says to the kidnapper, let me free, and I will not talk about you, and I will not reveal your name as my kidnapper. But the kidnapper says, well, okay, of course, you promise that now, but once I let you free, you tell the police who I am. So how can we credibly commit to each other that, you will not talk about me and I let you go and be sure that I will not be arrested? So she, in the story, she reveals some compromising information about herself or himself that the person might also reveal once he's arrested. So that's an example in which credible commitments might work. I mean, it's an extreme example, and it's a fascinating story in Thomas Schelling. I studied money transfers. So I studied a phenomenon that would go in, how did you call them? Not boxes. You call them
three baskets. Yeah.
The three baskets. So
boxes,
the second basket for me is trade. And money laundering, money transfer is moving money from one place to another.
Right.
And so I studied with co-authors, especially the transfer of illegal money, so illegal transfer of money from China to Hong Kong and Macau in particular. So we did interviews there, and so we interviewed these sort of informal bankers that are on the border of the Chinese state that you can go to, give them money, and then you cross the border without money, without illegally transferring money. If you are Chinese, there are limits on how much you can transfer, and then somebody on the other side would give you the money that you have given the banker back in China. Or you go to the casino, and the casino would have the money ready for you. So this is a fantastic system that, illegal, but fantastically efficient.
Right.
So the credible commitment that the lady who was offering us the service said, look at me, I have a big shop. I'm not going to run away. I've invested a lot in my shop, in my bank. And so the very fact that I have invested a lot it was a nail polishing shop, and her husband had a restaurant across the road. So she was trying to tell us, we are committed to the community, we're not going away, and so you can safely give us the money. I did another study about the same phenomenon in Italy, and there was a barber who had a barber shop, and he had become the center in the community for, again, transfer of money from Italy to Afghanistan and Pakistan and vice versa. And again, his commitment was, look at me, I've got a big shop, I have a barber shop, I've invested a lot of money, I live here, I'm not going to run away with 100 euros or 200 euros. So these are the kind of credible commitments I have looked at in my work. And as we said earlier, these phenomena go under basket 2. So these are not mafia phenomena. These are phenomena which do not in themselves need a mafia. This is done by non-mafia people. These are done by people who are just ensuring that the money are transferred and arrive where they are supposed to arrive. It's called hawala, incidentally, in one version. And so this is a lot of money transfers to countries where there is no banking system are done this way. Somalia, Afghanistan, or a very bad banking system in Afghanistan, no banking system in Somalia. And it's done also by Chinese groups. And also it's done now, of course, it could be money that are legitimately made, maybe in the informal economy, but also could be drugs money. And so there is a intersection of drugs money into this informal money transfer system.
Wow, complex and interesting. And I didn't know it went back to Schelling, the credible commitment situation. That's interesting. Okay, so I often, ask guests for just sort of general negotiation tips, and there's usually some common themes that come up, from a principled negotiation angle, like, listen to get information and to create empathy, demonstrate understanding, make the connection with the other. So those sorts of things. But I'm curious if you can pinpoint any other sort of negotiation tips for deal making or reaching an agreement that you've discovered by studying these groups for so long. Anything at all on that?
Well, so I mean, as I said, I wouldn't negotiate with them really. So I wouldn't want to be involved in any negotiation with these people. But these people I study, they negotiate a lot between each other. They have constant negotiation, and a lot of their time is spent doing that, settling disputes, discussing issues, being very political about it. So the perception that the mafia is about killing each other and using violence is wrong. A lot of it is about talking and smoothing out problems. And so they themselves have negotiation skills that are certainly very, very important. And so that's certainly interesting. Now, what I learned by dealing with them is some along the lines of what you said, is to take them seriously, not to belittle them, to listen and not to lecture them. The worst thing is to go to an interview and lecture them on the evil of the mafia and the bad things they have done or other people have done. Something else I've learned is never to ask questions that put me in danger of knowing something that only I and my interviewee would know. So if I talk to somebody who so I don't want to know any secret that only I would know, because then if the stuff comes out, I would be pinpointed as the guy who revealed it. So never. So when I was talking to these people in my field work, especially for my PhD, I always said I want to know what everybody knows. I don't want to know anything that you tell me secretly, or even tell me what people in your profession think. And then naturally the interlocutor would talk about himself. But so you don't give the impression you want to discover things that that you don't know, in a sense, because then it makes them very suspicious. So this will be I'm not sure it's a negotiation tactic, but it's a way to respect them. I mean, notwithstanding what I said, these are people who I think should go to jail, and these are criminals. Yeah. They're also smart, and they also know what they're doing. They know the community they work in very well, and so you have to treat them with respect if you want to engage with them. And in my case, just to understand what they're doing, not to negotiate. I'm sure I can think about more. I mean, what they do when they interact with each other is very similar in a sense. So there is a rule in the Sicilian mafia not to ask questions unless you are told things you shouldn't ask, because again, it could be you could be an undercover agent, you could be you could be talking to the police. So ask only. So don't ask questions about stuff which is irrelevant to the situation. That's one. And also something else the mafia has. It's contrary to some famous politicians that are prominent today. Is that they are very serious when they talk, right? They don't talk loosely. If they make a promise, they stick to it. So they don't talk very much. They stick to their word. They don't break the word they give. They don't talk loosely and make flip-flopping. Or that would be considered to be really bad in this world.
Interesting. There's a lot that could be teased out of what you said, and perhaps for another day. But I mean, a lot of respect and trust and the power of information, and
yes,
a lot of good stuff. I don't want to keep you any longer, but I do want to ask two things. I said two things earlier. I got two quick things. Number one, just curious. It's such an interesting topic. How did you get involved in this, and what's your sort of interest and passion here? And then two, if people want to track down some of your books, and which books would you suggest they start with, and where can they find them?
Thank you very much. Well, I grew up intellectually in the late 80s and very early 90s. And that was when the Soviet Union was coming to an end. Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost, and the end of the Soviet Union. So I was very passionate about that transition or transformation, global, massive social and political and economic transformation. So I really wanted to study that. And so I went to Russia, to the end of the Soviet Union, early Russia, in the late 80s, early 90s, to study the transition. And of course, crime was very prominent at the time. And so I decided to do my PhD on this topic, on the transition and crime. And I had a very supportive PhD supervisor who had been working on Sicily. And so he gave me great advice, and I did the PhD on that. So my passion was really started off not so much from Italy, but a fascination with the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of New Russia. Now, to the books. So I've got a web page called federicovarese.com. So I think if you Google it, you'll find it. And I have a page on my books on that web page. And I think if people are interested in the mafia, probably the best book is a book titled Mafia Life, which came out in 2018, I think. And it's easily available, and it's been translated in, I think, 7 or 8 languages. So it's available in several languages, but it's easily available in English and quite cheap on Amazon or the publisher's webpage. That would be probably a good way to start. But my last book is called Russia in 4 Criminals. So it's a kind of a story of the Russian transition from the 90s to today, seen through the lenses of 4 key individuals who happen to be involved in crime. So that's my last book.
We just scratched the surface here. I recognize that. I think we covered some good ground, though, and it's really interesting. And I just wanted to thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at cian.org. That's CIIAN.org.